Hey everybody, welcome to the 2024 federal budget summary, showdown, smackdown, whatever you want to call it. It's an exciting time to be an economist. Let's get into it. What I thought I'd do is I'll show you kind of the key aspects of the budget through a really good article in the conversation. I'll make a link to this particular article in the description of the video if you want to read further into this, or as you'll see, it's a bit of an interactive one if you wanted to go a little bit further in it. So, federal budget, let's get into it. What the federal budget is it is a plan. Okay, that's really important to understand. It's a plan for what the government thinks they're going to spend and what they're going to spend it on, and how they're going to receive the money in order to fund that spending. So it's just a plan, and that's why when you'll see sometimes in the budget documentation, it'll say for this year, for example, 2024 to 2025 budget, because it is a forward estimate, it is a forward plan of what they plan to spend and how they're going to get that money. What's really important to understand is, as it is a plan, well, it has to be approved by Parliament. And so just because they put these measures in the plan doesn't actually mean that those measures will actually go ahead. For the most part, they do, because usually the government in power has a majority in the Parliament. We're kind of getting into legal studies here, but it's just important for life to understand that if there's reasons why you might hear things announced in the budget, but not actually executed, that's why. Just so you know, for economics though, you are fine to talk about any policies in the budget that are planned to happen. Whether they happen or not, you don't need to worry yourself with. If that's a planned expenditure or a planned receipt, you can talk about it. Okay, so we're going to start with, in this article here, some visualizations which I think are really, really handy. So here, if you have a look at this particular chart, you've got the big buckets of spending for the government. So we're focusing here on all spending, and the size of the bubble represents the size of the spending. The color of the bubble here will determine here how much that has actually changed in this particular budget compared to prior times. So just spending. And when you hover over here, it'll actually tell you what they are. So for example, you can see there's a really big bubble here. This is, by the way, the federal government that pays money to the states and territories, which you don't need to worry about. But there's a big bubble here on social security and welfare, and the program is support for seniors. And so when we talk about an aging population and why this is a problem moving forward for Australia, this is why. Other than the funding that the federal government gives the states, this is the biggest bucket of spending for the government is senior support. And when we think of welfare, this is by far the biggest chunk of welfare. Even though some in the news might bang on about, job seekers and dole bludgers and all that being such a big issue. What I want to show you here, if the size of the bubble represents the amount of expenditure, this is what we're spending in welfare on support for seniors. And this little tiny one here is what we're spending on job seekers. So just a little bit of clarity there. You've got to look at the numbers to understand it. But there's lots of big chunks here. So a big chunk is defence. A big chunk is this thing called the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And then there's lots of different areas that make up the spending. I'm going to skip these two other boxes here and go into what we call the fiscal outlook. You don't have to worry too much about what fiscal means. It just means budgetary. But what's important here is what this shows is the balance between what the government is planning to spend and then what the government is planning to receive in receipts. So revenue here, receipts, and expenditure here in payments. And this is interesting because if I scroll down, what you'll see is of the planned government expenditure, the large majority of that is due to policy. Now, in economics, we're going to call that discretionary spending. We're going to call this things that the government is choosing to spend money on, as outlined in the budget. And as a proportion of the overall payments of $726 billion, the choice or discretionary payments are much more significant than the automatic stabilizers within the budget here. They call them external factors here. So external factors are outside of the government's control. Then when we look at the money coming in, this is really interesting because look, the colours are switched. And so what does that tell you about the budget? Well, the large majority of the money that comes in as a result of the budget is actually not in control of the government. And we call these automatic stabilisers. So it's automatic stabilisers for both. So what's driving this is revenue earned by the government on a really low unemployment rate. So since we've got such a low unemployment rate, everybody is just paying much more income tax. So we've got more people that have transitioned from welfare to unemployment. Therefore, they're paying much more income tax. And therefore, there's more receipts coming in on the government. The government didn't really do anything specifically to get those people from unemployed to employed. However, they're getting a lot more revenue as a result of it. Also, we've got things like commodities prices. We've got kind of lived in the past. So company tax is at an all-time high because company revenue is at an all-time high. The government's not doing any specific policy to get all that extra money in. It's just coming in automatically. And so when we're evaluating the role of the government in driving what we call, here they call it the budget balance, or also known, we're going to call it the budget outcome, most of the money that the government gets in and what they plan to get in the budget is out of their control. And it's what we call that automatic stabilizer. It's going to happen automatically. And so when we're critical of government budgets, or you might hear in the news people saying, oh, certain government is really bad or good at economic management, most of it's out of their control. It's just money that comes in based on external factors or just the way that the domestic and international economy is running. But let's get into the actual discretionary aspects of the budget. So here is a little summary screen. We're going to go into much more detail on this in class, but this screen here outlines the major spending initiatives of the government in this particular year's budget. So you'll see the big one that we're going to talk about is this energy bill relief spending. Okay, so the government is, and I will go up a little bit more, sorry, I forgot to say that. You're going to see here that the government is forecasting that they're going to be $28 billion in what we call deficit. Now, that word we should be familiar with, deficit meaning less. And so the government is forecasting that they're going to be spending $28 billion more in payments than they are in receipts. And a big reason for that is the cost of living crisis that so many people are in at the moment. And so to help with that, now I'll go down to this, what the government's doing is they're spending $3.5 billion, which just for context is a lot of money for the budget. Any policy that I recommend you take into the exam as examples of government policy, anything above 100 million is usually a good kind of threshold to use. And this is 3.5 billion. Remember, a billion is 1,000 million. It's like eons bigger than $1 million. So 3.5 billion over 3 years for energy bill relief. I'm going to talk about that one in a little bit more detail later. I'm going to skip the pharmaceuticals because it doesn't really help us link to too many things in the study design. But this one I will talk about, and this is the income tax cuts. So the government has released a new scaling of income tax payments depending on how much you earn. I'm certainly not going to go through it in the video today because it's a bit more complex, but we will in class, where essentially every single taxpayer will be paying less income tax as they did if they earned the same amount a year before. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is to help with the cost of living pressures that we're under, because if we pay less tax, we retain more income, which is a good thing, helps us pay our bills. But the other thing is we've got some, for the first time in a long while, some wage growth. And so as people earn more money, there's this thing called bracket creep, which we'll talk about in further detail in class, where if you start to earn more money, well, you're going to fall into higher and higher tax brackets. And so over time, if we didn't change the tax brackets, everyone will be paying the highest marginal tax rate. And obviously we can't have that. That's not very equitable and doesn't encourage participation in the labour force. So there's a readjustment there of the income tax brackets. They're also simplified, but essentially middle income Australians will be taking home a lot more of their pay packet, and those at the edges, either on the low or the high, will still take home a little bit more than they did before, but the impacts aren't as strong. The only other one I want to talk about in broad sense is this renewable industries one. So 19.7 billion, again, that is a huge amount of money for Australia to boost renewable industries. And so what this one is about, and you might have heard us refer to this policy earlier in the year, but this is essentially to give incentives to businesses to invest in these areas so we can have a comparative advantage in renewable industries. So let's talk about some of those details very, very quickly. So cost of living. We've got the main areas here that we want to kind of talk about in class is this one here, the energy bill relief. And the detail is kind of on the screen here, which is what you need to know. Households are going to get a $300 rebate split into 4 equal rebates over the course of the next financial year, so $75 a quarter. The reason for that is to hopefully not stoke the flames of inflation. Because as you know, if people have more money in their pockets, they're much more likely to spend that money, and that will drive up inflation. Whereas if you're only giving people $75 for 3 months, they're likely just to absorb that, and the impacts on spending won't be as immediate and won't be create as many widespread shortages as would be the case if everyone just got $300 in their pockets overnight. So households are going to get $300 spread over the year, and small businesses will get a $325 rebate. Now, what's important is it says rebate. So this isn't a bank transfer going from the government to households. Instead, it's just going to come off their energy bills. And so when the Australian Bureau of Statistics measures the price of things, as we learned about a couple of outcomes ago, well, the price of energy will naturally come down. And I think forecasts for this particular policy will say this one policy should drop inflation by 0.5%, which is massive, which is absolutely huge for one particular policy. So the idea here is to ease cost of living pressures without adding to inflation. And so it's a really tight balance that the Treasurer Jim Chalmers here is looking to go for. Going to skip health, and we're going to go to housing here. So this one is a huge piece of expenditure of $6.2 billion has been added to the Homes for Australia plan. We're going to talk about this policy a little bit later in Area of Study 2, but essentially the government wants to build 1.2 million homes in the next 5 years. This is obviously to help the rental crisis that's happening at the moment, and again, cost of living. Increase in supply of houses should bring down the price of houses, which should help Australians get into their purchase of a house, but also then ease capacity constraints in the rental market as well. And then finally, as far as specific policies goes, this $19.7 billion is something that I'll get you guys to hopefully remember to support Australia to become a renewable energy superpower. Essentially, this is subsidies and incentives for businesses to invest in these areas so we can become a key exporter moving forward in renewable energy. All right, so let's just look at a couple of charts to finish things off. So there's a lot of information on this chart. Obviously, the black or grey lines at the top are when the government has achieved a budget surplus, which means they received more money than they spent. Okay, the red lines represent a budget deficit where they have spent more money than they have received. And you'll see, obviously, these are the COVID years in 2019 and 2020 with huge government expenditures. Last year is this one here. We haven't quite got the full expenditure and receipts numbers for the year that has just gone, but we are forecasting a small budget surplus, and the year before a relatively larger budget surplus. But you can see in the current budget, which is the one I've got highlighted at the moment, we are forecasting a budget deficit, which means the government is planning to spend more money than they are earning. And what effect that will have on the economy is way back in Area of Study 2, I think it was, of the first outcome, where injections and leakages. We're going to bring that concept back here. Here, the government is injecting more money into the economy through government spending than they are leaking from the economy. And so the goal here is to grow. As we know, our GDP growth rate is below our target range of 3 to 3.5%. And so this is the budgetary policy measure to try to reverse that trend and uptick. Because if there's more injections relative to leakages, there will be more economic activity, there will be more GDP as producers match their level of output to that increased level of demand. And then finally, I think this is finally, oh, no, two more. This is the forecast in real GDP. And so as you're going to see, remember, black is the line, what happened before now, actual numbers. And then the current year forecast is a full year growth rate of 1.8%, which, as you know, is well below our 3 to 3.5%. And you're going to find for the next foreseeable future, growth rates are going to stay down pretty low. And so when the government is forecasting what they're going to get in revenues and expenditure, well, if GDP growth is low, well, then receipts from income tax and company tax and all the other types of taxes are going to be lower than what they would ordinarily want to be. And then when GDP is low, they have to inject more in the economy. So it's like a double whammy. Not only are they receiving less money because of reduced levels of taxes, which will push the budget outcome into deficit. But they're also needing to spend more money to stimulate the economy, further pushing it into deficit. And that's why the relationship between this chart, low GDP growth, matches with this one up here showing budget deficits there, because the economy is looking to be fairly soft over the next few years. The level of receipts relative to expenditure is going to be lower, and then so they're going to be spending more than they're earning here. Now, a big reason why this budget deficit, forecast budget deficit, isn't bigger than it was originally planned to be, this plan was all the way down here a year or two ago, is because of wages. And so if we have a look at our final chart here, we've got red inflation in the chart and grey here in wages. So we've found here inflation, as we well and truly are aware of, is coming off these peaks, and we're forecasting inflation to settle kind of around this projected range in a few years' time. Now, when inflation stays down but wages go up, well, people then are going to be paying more income tax. And as a result, then that should help the government reverse the trend and stop the decline of significant budget surpluses. And we're going to talk about the effects of that increase in wages relative to inflation further on throughout the year. So that was a really, really quick summary of the budget. Essentially, to summarize, the government here is looking to stimulate economic activity, but the way they're looking to do that is a non-inflationary measure. So a lot of the government policies here are about subsidies to reduce the price of things, to ease those cost of living pressures, and also to increase productive capacity in the economy by, for example, the building new homes. So by building new homes, that increases productive capacity in the household and building sector, which, as you know, when the AS curve shifts to the right, because productive capacity increases, we have less resource shortages, so on and so forth. Prices should come down. So it's a really tight balancing act that the Treasurer here is trying to manage to stimulate the economy, but not generate more inflation. Hopefully that was helpful. Happy learning.